The night was loud. That was the first thing Mara noticed when she walked into the great hall. Not the gold light hanging from the rafters like trapped sunlight. Not the long tables pressed end to end and loaded with food that smelled like someone had been cooking since dawn. Not the 200 pack members dressed in their best, faces flushed, voices high. The noise. She had lived inside this pack for 6 years. She knew the difference between their sounds. Laughter at a pup's first shift, bright and startled and a little relieved. Laughter at a fight won, low and satisfied, chest deep. Laughter when someone said something cruel, and everyone agreed it was fine to think so. This was the third kind. Mara stood in the doorway for a moment longer than she needed to. Her dress was dark green. She had ironed it herself that morning, pressing the hem flat against the table with her palm, because the iron had given up 3 months ago, and she hadn't replaced it. She didn't know why she was thinking about that. She pressed the thought down the way you press down a lid on a pot that wants to boil over. She walked in. Her seat was at the far left of the second table. Not exile, just the far left of the second table. She sat down. The woman beside her was talking to someone else. That was fine. Mara poured herself water from the jug, drank half of it, and looked down the hall toward the main table where Darian sat. He was laughing at something his beta said. She looked at her glass instead. She had been looking away from Darian for 14 months. She had gotten good at it, the way you get good at anything you practice constantly. The way it had started to feel like a skill she could be quietly proud of. Look at the glass. Look at the food. Look at the crack in the stone wall above the left window. It had gotten longer since spring, and no one had fixed it, and she had been tracking its progress the way people track slow disasters they cannot stop. The crack was longer again. She ate her bread. She drank her water. She sat there in the loud room being perfectly fine. Darian stood up after the third course. The room went quiet the way rooms do when an alpha commands it. Not because anyone is told to stop, but because the body makes the choice before the mind does. Spine straightening, hands stilling. The ancient animal part of everyone recognizing a shift in the air. Mara recognized it too. She wrapped her hands around her glass. He spoke the way he always spoke at formal occasions. Clear, unhurried, the kind of voice that made people feel like the world was being run competently and they were lucky to be in it. He thanked the cooks. He acknowledged the season. He said something about the pack's strength, and the room rumbled in agreement like a pleased animal, and then he paused in the way that meant the actual news was coming. Mara's hands tightened. Don't. She told herself that. One word. Practical. He said Celeste's name. Celeste was from the Northern Territory. Mara knew this already. Had known it for 9 days actually, since the word had reached the pack through the channels that pack gossip always moved. Which is to say through everyone, immediately, before any official announcement. 9 days of knowing. 9 days of waking up in the morning, and making tea, and sitting by the window, and looking at the tree line, and telling herself she was fine. She was fine. She had been fine since the mark, if you defined fine as functional, and she did. She defined it exactly that way. Celeste stood. She was. Mara looked at her glass. She knew without looking. She had seen her before, twice, at interpack events. Celeste was the kind of woman who entered a room and the room reorganized itself to accommodate her. Not because she was loud, but because some people just had that gravity, that particular pull, and fighting it felt pointless. The room was applauding. Mara applauded too. Her hands made the sound. Her face made the appropriate shape. She was fine. Low blood mates do tend to cling. Celeste said it conversationally, the way someone mentions the weather. She was talking to the woman on her right, but she was pitched to carry. She had that kind of voice, designed to be heard exactly as far as she wanted it to be heard, and not 1 inch less. Mara was exactly that distance away. It's almost sad, Celeste continued, the attachment they form. You'd think they'd understand their position, but I suppose when you come from nothing, you mistake proximity for belonging. The woman on Celeste's right laughed, a small, agreeable sound. Mara looked down at the glass in front of her. There was a crack in it. She hadn't noticed that before. Small, starting at the base, moving up the side in a clean diagonal line. Someone had been using a broken glass all night and just hadn't mentioned it. She pressed her thumb against the crack. Across the table, the man beside Celeste said something Mara couldn't hear. Celeste responded. Whatever she said, it made Darian laugh. Not a polite laugh, not a social laugh. The full one. The one he had. The one that went all the way to his eyes. The one she had heard across a campfire once. The one that had made her think, stupidly, that. She stopped that thought. The crack in the glass was 11 lines, she decided. No, 12 if you counted the small branch at the top. 12. 12. She pressed harder. Outside the hall, behind the granary, against the cold stone wall with the tree line dark in front of her and the stars doing absolutely nothing useful overhead, she cried. She cried the way she did everything, without making noise about it. Her shoulders did not shake. She did not cover her face. She just stood there, and her eyes produced tears, and she let them, because there was no one to see, and it was dark, and she had 14 months' worth of being fine, stored up somewhere, and apparently tonight was its scheduled release. Through the open hall doors, carried on the cold air, his laugh again, she stopped, not gradually, not as a process. She just stopped, mid-breath. The tears were there, and then they were not the priority anymore. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. Then she looked at her hand. Then she looked at the tree line. She went back inside and got her coat. Her room was on the 3rd floor of the eastern wing. Small. She had made it livable over 6 years, the way you make anything livable, incrementally, without expecting help. A rug she found at a market 2 towns over. Curtains she sewed herself from fabric that was on sale, because the pattern was wrong, and she liked the wrong pattern, actually. She thought it was interesting. A small bookshelf. A desk by the window. She did not turn on the overhead light. She turned on the small lamp by the desk, which gave the room a low, amber quality, like being inside a memory. She stood in the center of the room for a moment. Then she got the bag from the top shelf of the wardrobe. She did not pack dramatically. She had packed under worse conditions. 3 shirts, 2 pairs of trousers, underwear, socks, the wool sweater that was technically falling apart at the left cuff, but warm enough that she'd been keeping it past its reasonable life. Her grandmother's knife, wrapped in cloth, placed flat against the bottom of the bag because it was the kind of thing that needed to travel in dignity. The folder went in next. The folder was practical. The folder contained a copy of her PAC registry documents, copies of financial papers, a list of contacts in 2 other territories, people who owed her favors or who she had helped enough that they would not turn her away, an amount of money she had been building for 4 months in a separate account, a little at a time, the way you don't notice the tide going out until the beach is suddenly larger than you remembered. She had started the folder before she was certain she would need it. She had started it because some part of her, the part that had watched the crack in the great hall wall get longer through 3 seasons without anyone fixing it, had known. She folded 3 changes of clothes. She placed her boots at the base of the bag. She went to the bathroom and got her toothbrush and the small soap she liked, and she came back and put those in too. Then she stood by the desk for a moment and looked at the small drawer. She opened it. The ultrasound printout was folded in thirds. It had been folded in thirds for 2 weeks. She had not unfolded it since the day she brought it home, and sat in this room and looked at it for a long time, and then folded it in thirds and put it in the drawer, because she needed somewhere to put the thing that was happening to her. She did not unfold it now. She placed it between the 2nd and 3rd shirt. Then she pressed her palm flat against the outside of the bag, against the place where it was. 1 breath. 2. She zipped the bag. She did not look at the bed. She turned off the lamp. She picked up the bag. She walked out of her room and pulled the door shut behind her with the specific kind of quietness that is not about being sneaky, but about being precise. The latch clicked once. Clean. She went down the back stairs. The back stairs came out near the kitchen corridor, which was dark and smelled like the end of dinner, garlic and fat, and the particular metallic smell of a lot of dishes being washed. She moved through it quickly, not running, just purposeful, the way you move through spaces you know well enough to navigate without looking. The side door was unlocked. It was always unlocked. She had noticed that 6 years ago on her first week here, had noticed it every week since, and had never said anything because sometimes the thing that lets others in is the same thing that lets you out. Cold air, the yard, the dark. She kept moving. The bond pulled. She had expected it. She had read about it. Informally, quietly. The kind of reading you do when you're trying to understand something without asking anyone directly, because asking would require explaining why you're asking. Pack bonds were not chains. But they were not nothing. They were more like, she thought about this as she crossed the yard, more like a fishhook. Not a rope, not a chain, a hook. The difference being that a rope or a chain, you could see where it attached. You could work at the attachment point. A hook was different. A hook was buried somewhere inside the meat of you, and the pain of it was not constant. It was triggered by movement, by the act of pulling away, and the further you went, the more the embedded part made itself known. She kept walking. The fishhook pulled. She acknowledged it the same way she had acknowledged the tears outside the granary. Let it happen, noted it, kept moving. The tree line reached up around her as she entered the forest path. Pine and cold and the specific dark of a place where human light doesn't reach. She had a small torch in her bag. She didn't use it yet. She knew this path for the first mile. The young guard was at the boundary marker. She had known he would be. She knew the rotation. He was 18, maybe 19. He had the kind of face that still surprised itself when it needed to be serious. Like seriousness was a new feature his face was learning to run. He looked up when he heard her. Mara. Evening, she said. He looked at her bag. His face ran through its options. Family matter, she said. Southern counties. I'll be back before things get complicated. She had phrased it exactly that way on purpose. Before things get complicated was the kind of sentence that made people not want to ask the follow-up, because the follow-up might implicate them in whatever the things were. He nodded. Safe travels, he said. She walked past him and past the boundary marker and onto the road that was not Pack Road anymore. She heard the bond go quiet, not break. She had expected breaking, maybe, some kind of seismic internal event. But it wasn't that. It was quieter. It was like standing in a room where a television has been on for 14 months and then stepping outside. The silence was not absence. The silence was just different air. The signal still existed somewhere. She just couldn't tune to it. By the first mile, it was the low sound of a television in another room. By the third mile, she could no longer hear the channel. By the sixth mile, it was static. The specific static that isn't nothing. That's just signal that's traveled too far to stay coherent. She walked. The road through the forest came out near the highway by around 4 in the morning. She knew this because she had timed it. She had timed it 3 months ago when she had driven this route for another reason, going slowly, watching the odometer. She had told herself at the time she was just curious. She had not been just curious. A truck stop sat at the junction. Orange light and diesel smell and a couple of rigs idling in the lot. Inside was a man in his 50s with a feed delivery to a town she had never heard of, 42 miles south. He was leaving in an hour. She offered him $20. He looked at her, then at her bag, then back at her, with the look of a person doing a calculation that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with whether this was the kind of situation that would cause him problems. She looked back with the look she had spent 6 years perfecting. The look that said, I am not running from something dramatic. I am solving a problem. I would like to solve it in your truck. He nodded. He went back to his coffee. She sat on the bench by the window and ate crackers from her bag and waited. The truck smelled like engine oil and old upholstery and something that might have once been coffee. She sat in the back. There was a small rear seat, barely a seat, more a suggestion of one, and watched the road come and go in the headlights. Dawn came the way it always did in autumn. Gray first, then reluctantly lighter, like the sky was not enthusiastic about the commitment. She ate more crackers. Her stomach had opinions. It had been having opinions for 3 weeks, which was one of the reasons she knew, and also one of the reasons the folder existed, and also one of the reasons she was sitting in this truck at this hour with 40 miles of road behind her and more ahead. She pressed her hand to her abdomen. Not gently, practically. The way you check a wound, not to comfort it, just to verify its current status. We're out. That was the thought. Not, I love you already. Not, I'm terrified. Not, what have I done or where are we going or how does this work now? Just, we're out. The truck moved through the gray morning. Fields on both sides, flat and cold, and going nowhere in particular. The driver had the radio on low. Some man talking about something Mara didn't try to follow. The words were just sound, background. She finished the crackers. She put the empty wrapper in her bag because she was not the kind of person who left her garbage in other people's trucks. She looked out the window. The thing about a bond is that everyone talks about breaking it like it's the catastrophic part, like the break is the wound. But Mara had come to think, in the 6 months of reading, and the 4 months of planning, and the 2 weeks of knowing the things she now knew, that the break wasn't the wound. The wound was the 14 months before it. The wound was the choosing to mark someone and then treating the mark like an inconvenience. The wound was the laugh. The actual leaving was just logistics. She was good at logistics. She thought about the folder in her bag and the contacts in 2 territories, and the amount of money in the separate account, and the address of the woman in the southern counties who had offered her a room once, genuinely, without subtext, in the way that some people occasionally offered things genuinely and without subtext, and whom she had not forgotten. She had not forgotten any of it. The truck turned south. There is a specific kind of grief that doesn't feel like grief while it's happening. Mara knew this not because she was wise, but because she had felt the other kind, the obvious kind, the kind with a shape you could identify, when her grandmother died, when she was 19, in a hospital room that smelled like floor cleaner and the particular staleness of machines running on people's behalf whether they wanted them to or not. That grief had been obvious. It had a before and an after. It had moved through her the way weather moves, arriving, present, and then eventually past. This was different. This grief did not have a shape. It was more like background radiation, like something that had been present so long it had started to feel like the normal level. Like she had calibrated herself to it so gradually she had stopped registering it as loss and had started registering it as condition. The pack, the haul, the gold light, the man with the full laugh who had looked at her across a campfire once with an expression she had understood and then spent 14 months reinterpreting. The crack in the wall above the left window, longer every time she checked. She had not fixed it. It was not hers to fix. She had just watched it. The woman in the southern counties was named Peta, which was a name Mara had always liked for its efficient simplicity. She was in her 60s, had left her own pack 20 years ago, under circumstances she described once as complicated in the way that most things involving men in charge tend to be complicated, and had since built a life that fit her, a house on a half-acre plot with a garden that was doing better than any garden had a right to do in that soil, and a dog named after a county in the Western Territories. Mara had met her at an inter-territory health conference 3 years ago. Peta had given a talk about herbal fever management. Mara had asked 2 questions. After the session, Peta had found her in the hallway and said, "You ask good questions. Here is my address. If you ever need a place that doesn't require explanation, use it." Mara had written the address down. She had not told anyone she had written it down. The truck dropped her at a crossroads town she had never visited. There was a bus station. There was a schedule on the wall. She read it, did the math, bought a ticket with cash from the stack she kept folded in the inside pocket of her jacket. Not all of the money, but enough for today, and sat on a plastic chair and waited. The bus was 40 minutes late. She ate the second packet of crackers. She thought, the baby needs something other than crackers. She thought, the baby will have other things, starting later today, starting as soon as she could get to a town with a market and buy actual food. She thought, baby is a strange word. She had been thinking heir in her head, which was not affectionate, but was honest. This was Darian's heir. This was also hers. These facts coexisted without needing to be reconciled right now. The bus came. She got on it. She arrived at Peta's door at 2:30 in the afternoon. She knocked twice. Peta opened the door, looked at her, looked at the bag, looked at her face, and looked at the bag again. She said, "Tea or something stronger." Mara said, "Tea. I can't have the other thing right now." Peeta looked at her for one more second, the kind of look that understood everything and was going to be polite about what it understood. "Come in," she said. "The room is ready." The room had been ready. That was the thing Mara kept coming back to. Later, when she was lying on the narrow bed in the corner room with the curtains that were the wrong pattern, different from her own curtains, a different wrong pattern, blue instead of the rust-colored one she'd left behind, and looking at the ceiling in the particular way of someone who is too tired to sleep. The room had been ready, not for her specifically, it was just always ready, but it meant that Peeta was the kind of person who kept a room ready, which meant Peeta had understood something about the world, that people occasionally needed a place without explanation, and that keeping a room for that purpose was one of the most useful things a person could do with a spare room. Mara thought about the room she had just left, the rug from the market, the wrong pattern curtains, the bookshelf, the desk. Someone would go through it, eventually, maybe tonight, maybe tomorrow, whenever her absence was noticed and processed and responded to. She had not left a note. She did not think a note would have helped anything. A note would have been an explanation, and an explanation would have been an invitation to argue, and she was not interested in an argument about whether she was allowed to leave. She was already gone. That was the argument, and she had won it. She took the ultrasound out of the bag the next morning. Not dramatically. She was sitting at the small table in the corner of the room with her tea and a piece of toast that Peeta had knocked on the door and left outside without ceremony, and she took the printout out of the bag and unfolded it and put it on the table beside the tea. She looked at it. It was very small. The image was grainy and gray, and looked, if she was being accurate, like a weather satellite photo of a small storm system over the ocean. But she knew what she was looking at. She had sat in a clinic 2 weeks ago and had the specific experience of someone pointing at a gray blur and saying, "This is the heart," and she had looked at the gray blur, and her own heart had done something she still did not have a word for. Not joy, not fear, not love exactly, not yet. Something more like recognition, like something had said here, and she had said yes, and they had agreed. She folded it back into thirds. She put it back in the bag. She drank her tea. She ate her toast. She thought, we need a plan, a real one, not the folder. The folder was the escape route. What she needed now was what came after the escape route, the actual life, the income and the territory and the housing and the healthcare, all of it, because none of it sorted itself out without a person behind it doing the sorting. She was the person. She was good at logistics. She picked up her phone and started making calls. Back in the gold-lit hall, though she didn't know this, and she wasn't thinking about it, and even if she had been, she would not have allowed herself to sit with it. Darian was still at the main table. He was laughing at something his beta said. The hall was warm, the food was good, the woman beside him had her hand on his forearm in the light, easy way of someone who belonged where she was. He reached for his wine. Across the hall, at the far left of the second table, there was an empty seat. He didn't look at it. She didn't know that. She was 42 miles south in a room with blue wrong-pattern curtains, making a list on the back of a receipt from the bus station because she hadn't unpacked her proper notebook yet. The list had 7 items on it. She crossed off 2 of them before she went to sleep. Tomorrow she would cross off more. She pressed her palm flat against her abdomen, just for a moment. We're out, she thought again, not because it needed repeating, but because it was the only thought she had that felt entirely true. The gray morning light came through the curtains. She slept, and somewhere in the middle of that sleep, not dramatically, not with a cinematic swell, something shifted. The static in her chest where the bond had lived went from the sound of a television in another room to something quieter, something that had stopped expecting a signal. Not healed, just reorganized. The air didn't know any of this yet. But it would, and it would know it from her version, the accurate one, the one told by someone who did not laugh at tears. She slept on. The crack in the great hall wall grew longer in the night. No one fixed it.